So guys, recapping what we saw in the previous video. Sir, is it okay if I take a look? Sure, go ahead. You pick it up. You grab it this way so as to make sure you don't cut yourself. Pull it out. You use the handle for its intended purpose. You feel the balance. You don't start smearing your fingerprints all over the blade because you're gonna upset the guy in front of you. Just by looking at it, you will have a good idea if it's sharp or not. Look at the type of geometry you have in the knife and start asking questions and interacting with the dealer and the person in front of you. Now, before I said that this is commonly found in handmade knives and in custom-made knives, and this is most often found in production knives. The reason for that is that this is much easier made industrially with a couple of grinders on each side. You can achieve this shape out of a stock piece of steel. Same thing here, a flat grinder on this side, a flat grinder on this one, or here and here, and you can easily make these two as well. But here you need a more complicated type of machinery, so to speak. It has to be a belt grinder that goes around, and it's really not easy to do this unless you're doing it by hand, one by one. So that's why this is most often found in custom-made knives, in handmade knives, and these are more industrial type of grinds, as the one we have here, which would be this one. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the different uses for the knives. What are you gonna be using your knife for? These are probably some of the most typical choices for EDC knives. This is a cold steel, a tanto type blade, and this has the hollow grind geometry I was talking about before. You see how it reflects the light differently, and here we have a flat. I would prefer this one. I would prefer this rather than this shape, this geometry, though I really like the tanto tip for defensive purposes because it's very tough and it's going to be punching holes. When you cut into material, you see the different things a knife is capable of doing. Something like this is going to be punching a hole instead of separating material, such as this type of tip. But these are typical EDC knives. This is probably the epitome of a typical EDC knife, the Spyderco Endure. It's something you're gonna be using for opening packages, cutting food, cutting a sandwich, peeling an orange, an apple during your lunch break, and 100 different uses you may have in mind for it. It is also in some way a tactical defensive knife as well, because this can be used for self-defense. It's very sharp, it's big enough, the tip is going to be penetrating nicely, so you do have something that is capable of being used for self-defense. And that's basically it, the idea of the EDC knife. It's for general purpose use, nothing too big. It's mostly oriented to the city folks in some ways, though this is a knife that could easily do carry its own weight on the woods as well. But mostly this is something that is especially convenient to carry. Pocket knife, folding with a clip for the pocket. So if you're gonna be on the wilderness, on the sticks for a long period of time, you'll probably want something like this, a fixed blade, or I'd go for something even bigger, something like this. When it comes to wilderness knives and bushcraft, which is in vogue right now, it's pretty popular, the concept of bushcrafting. You see, everything is bushcraft. This is a typical bushcraft knife you see these days. This is a Mora knife from Sweden. This is an excellent knife, and I've reviewed this in my blog before. As you see, it's very thin compared to this one. As you see, the geometry is different. This is a very sharp knife and it does its job magnificently well, especially for the price. This costs about 15 bucks or so, and the metal is it's very nice, and it's also laminated steel. These are in fact 3 layers of steel. This is stainless, but it's incredibly sharp, very sharp. This is sharp as well, but not as sharp as this, though you do have a knife that you could probably hammer through a chunk of wood and not risk breaking it at all. This knife may not be as capable. Also, you have the tang, and this knife goes only this far. It has a narrow tang. A narrow tang gets thinner, goes through here. A full tang is something like this, goes all over the knife. Okay, so it is much more sturdy. Also, since this was made by myself, I made sure that it gets thinner to the edge, so the thickest part is here, so as to make it extra sturdy if I have to use it to pry something. These are all things that you find in custom made knives, but not as much in production knives. Production knives must be easy to manufacture. It's just a piece of steel with much more simple procedures used to make it. Still, it is very capable of doing its tasks. For the typical bushcraft uses that you're going to be looking at, say cutting a few chips of wood to start a fire, carving wood, or carving a spoon of some sort, all those different little tasks, this knife is perfectly capable of. Maybe if you start batoning with this through a bigger piece of wood, the narrow tang and the plastic handle could end up being a problem. But as long as you're careful, this would do okay. Though it's not as tough as this. Now, as popular as it may be, the idea of the bushcraft knife, I like it because the bushcraft knives keep getting smaller and more. They sometimes don't even have some sort of elevation here to protect your finger, so they are these knives that could easily slip. Your hand could end up slipping forward and catching yourself, but as long as they look bushcrafty, they are okay. Now seriously, this is okay for the purposes of bushcrafting. Now, if you're going to be using something in the woods for a long period of time, if you're going to be using a knife for making shelter even, you will want something like this, a bigger knife. This is a very old knife. This knife is probably over 100 years old. Look at this blade. This is a carbon steel knife. And as you see, it's all pitted, but even just pitted as it is, it still does its job well. It is pretty sharp. I've sharpened this. When I first bought it, it was in awful condition. This is nothing in comparison to the way I found it. But you have a cross guard here protecting your hand. It's not going to be slipping forward, catching yourself. And just because of the size of this, you're going to be able to hack through wood much easier than with some of the little bushcraft knives. So if you're going to be cutting pieces of wood for making shelters, for making fires, even though fire isn't that much of a problem, at least when I go camping, I don't have much problem starting processing wood to start a fire with something as small as this, or even just a folder knife such as this one. But if you do indeed need to make shelter, you're going to be needing something like this, unless you want to spend hours and hours doing something that could be much easier done with a larger knife. I'm running out of time, guys, so instead of making 3 parts, I'm gonna be making 4 of them. So see you on our part 3 video. Take care, folks.